make me narrower format too? Are we there? Are we live? Okay. Morning. How are you? I can make out everybody's face, even that far away. Hint, hint, hint. Okay. We're in the last study of Daniel this morning. And what we were doing was kind of setting the stage to go into Ezra and Nehemiah, and we may go into another couple of books, like Malachi. We may mold Malachi in there, because he was the prophet at the time. Nehemiah and Ezra were ministering to people, the Jewish people, trying to establish. So let's get into it. The timeline, okay? And this is looking at the kings in the Mead Persian Empire. Now, where we're at right now is the top two. Is Darius, or Darius, I like Darius, but Darius and Cyrus the Great. They're co-kings. One's a little bit stronger than the other one. Cyrus is stronger than Darius. But you remember when we had the part about the ram sheep. And he had one horn longer than the other one. That was the kingdom. It had two horns on it. Well, that's this kingdom. Talk a little bit more about this kingdom, kind of, like I said, we wanted to set the stage. The next one is Smyrtis. Notice his name doesn't look like Cyrus, his name doesn't look like Darius. And he had a very short time. And I'm going to talk about him some on the next slide. Next one is Darius the First, and I think it's Darius the Great. He had a long reign. The next one is Xerxes. Everybody's heard of Xerxes. Next one is Artaxerxes, or Artaxerxes. I like Artaxerxes. And he's Artaxerxes the First, and we have another Darius the Second. Then we have another Artaxerxes and another Artaxerxes. So this is kind of who the different kings are. This is the Mead Persian Empire. Things that are going on. Battle of Marathon. Who can tell me about the Battle of Marathon? Who fought at the Battle of Marathon? Okay, it had to be the Persians and the Greeks. And it was at Marathon. And they defeated the Persians at Marathon. And it was fighting against just the Athenians, just the people from Athens. When they defeated them, they got back on their ships, but then they sailed around and went to Athens, and they were going to destroy Athens, right? But a runner made it from Marathon to Athens overnight. How far do you think it is from Marathon to Athens?
26 miles.
26 miles. Isn't that amazing? We run marathons today, don't we? They're 26 miles. You know what the runner said when he got there? One word. Some people wear shoes that use that name. And it's not Adidas. Nike. You know what Nike means? Victory. And then he died. They had another battle. Battle of Thermopylae. Anybody can tell me about the Battle of Thermopylae? Anybody remember King Leonidas? The 300 Spartans. Ringing a bell? That's where they stopped the Persians for days as they were coming down. This is the second invasion under Xerxes. First one was Darius. Second was Xerxes. The Persians were attacking the Greeks. From this point on, it was the other way around. The Greeks started attacking the Persians. So at that particular point, you saw a decline in the Persian Empire. And the next empire, which was the ram, represented with the big horn, which was Alexander the Great, was coming to power. In that time frame, you have Ezra. Ezra's Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes. And actually a little bit of Cyrus. So we'll see that when we go in through the book of Ezra. Also, Nehemiah. You can see he's kind of tailed there on the end. So what were they doing? They were going to rebuild Jerusalem. And mixed in there is Esther. So they're all kind of nestled in there at the same time. So that's kind of why we spent a lot of time in the book of Daniel, was kind of giving you a little bit of stage to say, what's the environment like this is going to be in? You know, what are these people like? What were the Babylonians like? What were the Medes and the Persians like? And this kind of talks us into the next one. The Mede Persians were not known for their being nice, okay? They were cruel. The Babylonians were cruel. As far as punishment, and this was usually reserved for the people who were the executives, but they were creative in the way that they killed people and did things. They'd take your skin and turn it into lampshades, or turn it into chairs, or turn it into things like that. It was leather for them. So that was a punishment. They had a big tower full of ashes and cranks. And they'd throw you in the tower, and they'd crank it, and you would drown literally in ashes. And also the cranks were hitting you and breaking bones. Pouring gold down your throat. This is only reserved for a few because gold was precious. But they would just pour it down the throat. That one of the kings they had captured from one of the kingdoms, that's how they took care of the king. Trees. Bend the trees down, tie them to it, let the trees go, tear them apart. Crushing your servant's head. I always kind of thought this was interesting. You would really have to be attached to your servant. That would bother you, but that was one of their things that they did as a punishment. The next one was, if they took someone and they'd gouge out their eyes, they'd cut off their ears, they'd cut off their nose, they'd chain them by the gates so everybody could see. They were still alive. But what happens to you if you do something that they don't like? This one here is Smerdis. Remember I talked about how short a time frame he had the kingdom? Well, he was a magi, one of the priests. They called them magi over there. And he said, I'm a descendant of Cyrus. Well, they found out he wasn't a descendant of Cyrus. They killed him, and they killed all the other magi they could find. And they celebrated every year the fact that they had slaughtered them all. That's the mindset of the people that we're working with. Letting insects eat you alive. They'd take you and they'd strip you and tie you up in a boat, smear you with honey, and put you out there with insects. The insects didn't have anywhere to go, and they'd eat you alive. This one was a triple death. 3 things they would torture you. They'd torture you, gouge your eyes out. They'd stretch you on a rack or something like that for 3 days or 10 days. And then they'd nurse you back to health. And then they'd do the next thing, and they'd nurse it back to health. Then they'd do the next thing until it finally killed you. And the last one was make you eat your own children. That's the mindset of these people. When we study the other books, you got to understand how evil and cruel they were and be amazed at the things they did for God's people. It doesn't seem to make any sense except that God had to be involved. That's kind of the point to set the stage on this one here, as far as Darius and how he responds to Daniel in this particular situation. So, it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. So why is Darius now appointing satraps? Satraps are princes or governors or whatever you want to call them. Why would he be doing it now? Last week, when Doug taught, Belshazzar, right? Belshazzar was the king. He was the last king. Cyrus the Great took over the Babylonian kingdom, but the Persian kingdom. Darius is a brand new king. He's in Babylon. That's where he's running his part from. Cyrus, I think, is probably back in Persia. And that's how they're running it right now. So Darius needs people to help him administrate. So would it be difficult for him to decide who to be satraps and who not to be satraps? Does he know these people? He just conquered them. He doesn't know them. Okay, so he's kind of doing this, saying, what might he have looked at to figure out who he was going to appoint? And this is kind of important. This is a thread that goes through with a lot of things. It happened in the Babylonian kingdom and in the Persian kingdoms particularly. Things were written down. they kept copious records. So there would be records of other people who had been satraps in the past, maybe what the record was, how good they did, how bad they did, and he'd be able to consult that. What's unusual about including Daniel? Remember when Doug taught last week about Belteshazzar? Belteshazzar had the handwriting on the wall. Nobody could figure out what it was. And the queen mother, or the grandmother, said there was a wise man, Daniel. So Daniel's fallen out of everybody's view. Okay? Nobody knows about Daniel. Nobody in the kingdom really thinks about Daniel. But he picks Daniel up. Probably could have got that by word of mouth. Could have gotten that by looking at the records. Could have been both. He could have heard it word of mouth and went and looked it up. But he included Daniel. Then this Daniel began to distinguish himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Deja vu, huh? Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. So how do you think Daniel distinguished himself? Getting so much feedback.
God probably blessed everything that he touched, similar to what you saw with Joseph back in Genesis.
Yep, back in with Joseph in Genesis, God blessed what he did. There was also, Daniel was honest. Daniel had integrity. These other guys, they're a bunch of slime balls, okay? They were crooked. They wanted kickbacks and all kinds of things. What does it mean he had an extraordinary spirit? And I underlined "and." I can't hear you if you're saying anything. I know Wanda is, because I can see her mouth moving.
She said God was with him.
God was with him. I don't believe his spirit was in him, because everything had to be revealed to Daniel in a dream or a vision, right? Okay? He couldn't interpret it by himself. But he reflected God in the way he did things. What was Darius's plan? This guy that had been just kind of pushed off to the side and nobody paid attention to? Make him number 2 in the kingdom. Only person higher than him would be Darius. Another deja vu for the Babylonians that are now the satraps for Darius. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to the government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of a corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. So what did they look first for? Corruption, okay? Why do you think they looked there? Everybody's corrupt. He's got to do something wrong. We can find it. He didn't do anything wrong. He had integrity they couldn't even begin to fathom. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." So what did they believe was Daniel's weakness?
His weakness was his actual strength, his belief in his God.
Yeah, his weakness, their perceived weakness in him was his strength. But they didn't understand that. They looked at gods like their God. And by the way, Persians were monotheistic. They didn't have multiple gods. But they looked at it the same way. This is a God, but they didn't have a powerful God. And that's going to play in this particular chapter as far as the contrast between gods. How does that translate in the world we live today? What do people think of Christians?
I thought for sure you were going to ask what people think of politicians first.
Yeah.
No, I don't have that much time. You know, a lot of times we're regarded as weak, as powerless, things like that as far as Christians. Okay, they look at that weakness. They don't understand that's our strength. We rely on God, what God's word has to say. They say you can't think for yourself. It didn't bother Daniel one bit, did it? It was a long one. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever! All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. So here, like I said, they make a record and they live and die by that record. They tell the truth as far as how they offered this new law. What'd they lie about? Brand new satraps, he just appointed them. This is the first big thing they come with. What'd they lie about? They said, everybody agrees with this. Everybody thinks this is a great law. Who is he going to make number 2 in the kingdom? Daniel. Was Daniel consulted? Did Daniel agree? No. They lied to him. So how'd they get it through the king? How have they flattered him? What does this injunction do? How does it elevate the king?
Higher than your own God.
Yeah, higher than your own God. He says that worship gods or you, king. They said, oh, king, live forever. Okay, this is all flattery and everything like that. Should he have known something was going on? When somebody starts buttering you up, what are they doing? They want to slide something by you that you probably won't agree with if you really knew what was going on. Therefore, the king Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. So, hey, this sounds great. Everybody agrees. I'm great. I'll be up there with gods being worshipped. Matter of fact, I'll be the only one worshipped for the next 30 days. Isn't this great? Isn't this fantastic for me? You could see it all going to Darius' head. But what should have stopped him? He looked around in the room, saw all these people here. What should have stopped him? He didn't see Daniel. He didn't see his top guy that was going to be there, standing there. But he didn't. It went to his head. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had a window open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. How long is previously?
For Daniel, it's probably the last 90 years.
Yeah, it's into Darius's realm, into Darius's rule. So he spent 70 plus years under the Babylonian kingdom, and now he's in the Persian kingdom. So it's probably 75, 85, maybe as much as 90 years. That's what he's been doing. And everybody knew it. And he did it in an open area where anybody could see him doing it 3 times a day. Was he being obstinate? That's a closed-ended question. You should like that one. No, I don't think he was. Okay? He was serving God. He was giving worship to God because of God, how much God had blessed Daniel. So how do we face those challenges today of having to do something that the world wants us to do versus what God wants us to do? That challenge today? Anybody talk about one of those challenges? Any of those challenges today that we do, that the world would say that's wrong?
Things that God teaches that are wrong, sometimes you're put in a corner and you have to tell somebody that's just wrong. And they'll say, well, you can't say that because I have the right to do whatever. I think we're facing that, a little bit of that every day.
You do. People's opinions. People say, you can't have hate speech. God hates a liar. Is that hate speech? Would the world say you shouldn't say that about someone? God's very specific about homosexuality. In our society right now, those that employ in that are elevated. Look how good and strong of a warrior they are. God condemns it. So we have challenges in our environment today. Nobody right now is trying to kill us, but we do have those challenges today. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before God. Big surprise, right? Then they approached and spoke to the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man, besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast in the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes, the Persians, which may not be revoked. So who came to see what Daniel was doing? A subset of those who set things up. It wasn't all the princes and the governors, but it was probably the other two commissioners that saw Daniel being promoted over them, and a bunch of the satraps, maybe not all 120, but there was a bunch of them. So how did they begin to spring their trap? He said, remember that law you signed? You did that, right? You put that down. And Darius says, yeah, I did. I wrote it down, and it can't be changed. Nobody can change it. I can't even change it. They said, yeah, we'll make sure you understood that. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction which you signed, but keeps making this petition, his petition, 3 times a day. So there's the other piece. How'd they identify Daniel? An exile, one of those exiles from Judah. One of those people we brought in as slaves from Judah. Not somebody who had interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Someone who had been number 2 in the country, in the kingdom, underneath Nebuchadnezzar. Not someone who has interpreted for Belshazzar and been raised up by Belshazzar. Remember, he put the purple cloak on him and the gold chain around his neck? No. And not who Darius has come to know. He said, that exile, that Judah, that person that isn't a Persian, he does that. Daniel's behavior? How do you describe that?
They didn't say he was praying to his God, but it acted like he was asking for a petition from somebody else instead of the king.
He what?
A petition to someone else besides the king.
Yep.
To another king.
He didn't make a petition to you, he made a petition to this other God. And they said, he doesn't pay any attention to you. He doesn't respect you. Right? He says, he doesn't pay any attention to you. He doesn't respect you. Okay, he just goes off and does what he wants. You don't want this guy. What kind of reaction may they have been expecting? And I put on there Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Or as we know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You remember that? Remember that in the book of Daniel? Was when they would not worship the statue, the golden statue Nebuchadnezzar made, what did he do? He got furious that they refused to worship that statue. And he threw them in the fiery furnace that was heated 7 times hotter than it had ever been. Matter of fact, the people who were throwing stuff in it, it burned some of them up. It got so hot. And when they threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, they didn't get burned. The ropes got burned, and they were free, and there was a 4th person in there with them. But they were expecting that same reaction from Darius that they got from Nebuchadnezzar. Him to be furious that this Judah exile just ignored him and worshiped his own God. Did it go that way? No. This was different. This is, again, where I set the stage when I started this to say, you can see God here because he didn't react the way they expected him to react. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was very deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." I'm sure that went over big. So what was the reaction from Darius? Wasn't furious, was he? He was stressed. He knew he'd been had by these guys. And he was very distressed. He said, I've got to find some way to deliver this. This is the only guy I trust in the kingdom. So distressed? We don't know how long it's been since he appointed all the satraps and the commissioners. But evidently it's been enough time that there's been a bond between Darius and Daniel. What did they do as the day came to a close? What did the accusers do? Don't you love when somebody gets in your face? You're supposed to do this. You know that, aren't you? You're supposed to do this. They're in his face. It's the law. You wrote it down. You can't change it. You have to do this. Went over really big. What do you think his opinion is of these accusers, of these people he had appointed as satraps and governors and commissioners? Boy, did I make a mistake.
All of a sudden, the king has his own king. Somebody seems to be more powerful than the king.
Yeah, they have just outmaneuvered the king, using flattery to get what they wanted. Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you." So, what action was Darius forced into? This is easy. It's right there. He had to throw him in. He had to put him in a lion's den. What indicates the strength of that bond between Daniel and Darius here? What did Darius know? He knew about his God. He knew he constantly served him. But he got so caught up in the moment of saying, oh, wow, people are going to worship me for 30 days, nobody else. He really didn't think about that, did he? Because if he had really thought about it, he would have never assigned that injunction. But you can kind of see God moving through here. and what's being done. The last part, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. That's not a question. Darius already understands about the God of Daniel, doesn't he? But we'll get into this a little bit further. He's still not too sure. One indicates that the flattery that they had, the satraps and the commissioners, had gotten to him, and that if he'd been thinking clearly, I talked about that, he would never have signed it. If he'd really thought about it, that he knew that he served him every single day and what his routine was, because they were close enough, he never would have signed it. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of the nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So why seal the lion's den with the king's and some of the nobles' signet rings?
To make sure nobody could let him out.
Nobody could let him out. Make sure he stayed there. So nobody could, because if he survived, somebody could say, well, you pulled him out. You did something, you pulled a trick. No, nobody can say that he wasn't put in here. Nobody can say, for me, Darius, that I didn't follow the law of the Medes and Persians as it had to be followed. Okay? Made sure that was there. So what did Darius spend the night doing?
Fasting.
Fasting?
Not sleeping.
Not sleeping? Stayed awake. Have you ever had it where something was so vexing to your spirit and you were so worried about it, you couldn't eat, you couldn't sleep, you just didn't want any entertainment or anything like that? You said, just leave me alone. Just leave me alone. All I want, this just is eating me alive. That's where Darius is right now, because Daniel's in there. And like I said, it's the only person in the kingdom, from his perspective, he can trust. Doesn't even talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego now. I'm not even sure they're still alive, because they've been in captivity for so long and fallen captivity. But that's the state that Darius is in all night long. Doesn't get any sleep. Don't give me any food. I don't want to eat anything. Just leave me alone. I get like that when I get sick.
Hey, Chuck, I'm going to join on this. You can also see the prototype of what happens with Jesus when they put him in the tomb. They seal the rock. They put the guards in front so he can't get out. Nobody can get in there to change this thing. It's already put there by the king. And the people, maybe the same thing with the apostles and stuff. Could they sleep or not? And they showed up before the sun came up just to be there to bring, the women did, at least to bring spices and stuff. It's the same kind of thing. So I just thought I'd break that out while we're here.
Yeah, it was the same thing in the fact that they did seal it because the Jews didn't want anybody to claim that he resurrected. They wanted to say, he's buried, he's dead, he's buried, it's over. Okay, it's over. We don't want any influence from this Jew from Galilee. Actually was born in Bethlehem. And Peter and John were the ones that raced there. And when John wrote his book, he said, and I ran faster, but I let the other one go in first, which was Peter. But you have the same kind of, a very similar situation. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day, and he went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? So, digressing, and Doug already talked about it. How old do you think he is at this time? Late 80s, 90s. He just spent the night in a den of lions with probably remnants of corpses and bones and everything else, and lions all night long. That's not a very healthy environment for someone like that. So you can see God protecting him in what he did. So how did he seek to find out whether or not Daniel had survived?
Called out to him.
He said, yeah, are you still alive? Did your God protect you? So where he was sure, at least the way he made the statement when he put him in the den, to say, your God will protect you, he'll deliver you. All night long he's worried about it like that, and he's kind of a little shaky on that right now. Was he sure? Was he positive? Nothing like that had ever happened, had it? If you threw somebody in a lion's den, what happened? They got torn to pieces. I mean, it just happened, okay? And for the lions, that was kind of a triggered response. If something came flying into their thing, that was the only food they got, was the people they ate that somebody threw in there. So what was the crux of the question Darius asked Daniel?
Did your God protect you?
Huh?
Did your God come through?
Yeah. What power does your God have? Because Darius knew about his God, but he said, what power does your God have? Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king. I have committed no crime. What's Daniel first do? Kind of a normal greeting for the king. You, O king, live forever. Okay? Daniel wasn't harmed. Why? God protected him. Why did God protect him? He was innocent. Worshiping God is never a crime. That's the point. Worshiping God is never a crime. Did Daniel break the law? This is a conflict. For the law of Medes and Persians, he did. But from the law of God, he didn't. Which law is higher? God's. Always God's. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. That's not what I wanted. What was the next action? Oh, we'll get to the next action here. Or did I leave one? Ah, there we go. Then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Lions, 450 to 550 pounds. He doesn't need to bite you to kill you. He's got enough strength that he could beat you to pieces. So what was the action that Darius did? The very next thing.
Threw the men and their families into the lions.
Yeah, took the whole families of all those men that came in as accusers. Wasn't all of them, but it was some subset. I don't know how big it was. It was probably about 20, 30 of them. Took them and all their families and threw them in the lion's den. You kind of see the switch between Daniel and someone who's compassionate and someone who's showing love, and to what the more of the Medes and Persians were really like, which were cruel. I mean, the women, the children, the whole families, everybody goes in there. Family dog, I don't know. Everything went in there. Then Darius, the king, wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. And his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So you see a little bit in there mixing when we had the discussion on the statue that had the gold, the silver, the bronze, and the iron, and the stone. And the stone represented the kingdom that was forever. He understands God's kingdom. He understands that it's an eternal kingdom. And he's just been exposed to Daniel for a very short time. Who inspired Darius to make this decree? Take a chance. Give me an answer. God. God and Daniel. Okay? God through Daniel, but Daniel, because of who he chose to be, he was as much a reflection of God as he could. Wasn't he? He had integrity, he was ethical, but he was a servant of God. He knew his relationship with God was, he was a servant, God was in charge. What does his decree imply what he knew about God's? He said, his God is the living God. All the other gods, they're not living. They're dead. They don't do things like this God. So, this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And that kind of sets the stage because he brought in at the very end Cyrus. Because if you remember, Cyrus's reign extends longer than Darius's does. And it's underneath Cyrus that he sends Ezra back to Jerusalem. And Darius is the Mead, Cyrus is the Persian, and he's tougher than Darius. But that's what Doug's going to start on with Ezra next week, is to talk about what Cyrus does, which doesn't make any sense. Not with these people. You can see God. Questions? Well, thank you for your attention.
Hey, Chuck, let me back up on you for a second. Continue with that symbolism, looking at Jesus. I'm going to hit you, maybe, if I can turn this thing on. That makes sense. When you get basically that subset of the satraps and stuff, let me turn this down. They make the decision to throw Daniel to death. So they put him in a cave and they locked the door. Same thing with Jesus. It was that subset. It was the Sanhedrin that made a decision that Jesus had to die. They give him over to death, but at the end, where we see they throw the whole families into death, it's the same thing. Once you look, what the church sets up, they go to the Jews first, but basically they don't listen. The whole families are kind of given over to death the same way. The true life is Christ. If you don't want to look at it, you don't want to find it, everybody's given over to death too. So I just thought I'd add that to it. But that's where we're going anyways, is leading up to the kingdom of Christ. And you see little pieces of it.
Reflected.
Yeah, or prototyped or whatever it is. So, all right, thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Sing the